Hello everybody, my name is Elise Lassu. I am a researcher in the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, and it is my pleasure to give you today an introduction on police stops and unlawful profiling. What I would like to do today is, first of all, setting the scene by providing you with some of the findings that stemmed from surveys we conducted on police stops through the Fundamental Rights Survey, FRS, and the EU MIDIS 1 and 2 findings. Then I'd like to say a few words about lawful profiling. These are information that is stemming from a guide on lawful profiling and unlawful profiling that we developed a few years ago for law enforcement officers and border guards. And then in my third and final part of this presentation, I would say a few words about algorithmic profiling and how this can have specific challenges for fundamental rights. So we conducted a survey in 2019 with close to 35,000 individuals in order to gather information on the experiences with regard to fundamental rights of the general population. There were several topics that we discussed with interviewed persons, and one of these were police stop. As you can see on the slide, we developed a specific report with the result of these findings, if you are interested into it. These findings, we were able to compare them with other findings also in relation to police stops and stop and search conducted by law enforcement officers in 2008 and 2016, the EU MIDIS 1 and EU MIDIS 2 surveys that we conducted specifically with immigrants and descendants of immigrants. So it was useful because this allowed us to have comparable data and assess trends and evolution with regard to police stops. On this slide, you can see the target group that were interviewed by FRA in the EU MIDIS 2 survey. So as you can see, in Greece, we interviewed immigrants from Asia and South Asia and also Roma people. What did we ask the participants to the surveys that we interviewed? We asked them about the experience of police stop in the 5 years and the 12 months before the survey. So we asked them a specific question in relation to the most recent instance when they were stopped by the police in terms of the context. Did it happen when they were driving a car or when they were walking? How did the police act during the stop, how respectful the police was, and we also asked question in relation to whether the person that was stopped perceived the stop to be because of the immigrant or ethnic minority background. So here on this slide, you can see some of the results that stemmed from this survey. So overall, 14% of people in the EU were stopped by the police in the 12 months before the survey. Meanwhile, 27% experienced this in the 5 years before the survey. This is data that is coming from the Fundamental Rights Survey. The rate of being stopped by the police in the 12 months before the survey varies across countries. It ranges from 4% in Spain and 7% in both Malta and Romania to 21% in Ireland, 24% in Estonia, and 25% in Austria. An earlier survey into the specific experiences of people with immigrant or ethnic minority backgrounds that I just introduced in the previous slide, so the EU MIDIS 2 survey, revealed that 15% of minority experienced police stops. Here again, the results for immigrant and ethnic minorities vary even more. by country and by group than to the result of the Fundamental Rights Survey that collected information from the general population across countries. For example, in the 12 months before the survey, 49% of immigrants and descendants of immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa were stopped by the police in Austria, and 33% of Roma in both Croatia and Greece. By contrast, 4% of Roma in Bulgaria, 3% of immigrants and descendants of immigrants from South Asia in the UK, and 2% of Roma people in Romania were stopped in the year before the survey. With regard the context of the stop and the actions that were taken by the police during the stop, we notice that people with an ethnic minority or an immigrant background experience more often stops that involve the police searching them or their vehicle compared with the general population. More specifically, police performed a search on 34% of people with an ethnic minority or immigrant background who were stopped while moving on foot, compared with 14% of people in the general population without such a background. People with an ethnic minority or an immigrant background were more often asked for their identity papers and were people from the general population who were stopped. And this was either when they were walking or in a vehicle. As I said in the introduction, we also asked individuals whether they had a perception that they were stopped because of their ethnic background. In EU MIDES 2, 26% of the respondents were stopped by the police at least once in the 5 years before the survey. And of those that were stopped in the past 5 years, 33% say the last stop was because of their immigrant or ethnic minority background. The groups most often stops are respondents with North African, Sub-Saharan African, and Roma background. And it's important to note that these findings are similar to the findings stemming from the first EU MIDES survey that we conducted. So we see here that the trend is continuing. I will not say more about this for the sake of the time, but I would invite you to have a look at our Data Explorer and our reports that are available in our website. What findings of EU MIDES show is that despite awareness of stakeholders and decision makers, despite cases being brought to national and international courts, and despite the great work of several actors on the ground, discriminatory profiling remains a reality in the EU. Research has shown the negative impact the use of broad profiles can have on the individuals that are targeted and the community to which they belong. Profiling can result in increased levels of hostility in other encounters between individuals and the police or other law enforcement bodies. And greater hostility increases the chances that routine encounters will escalate into aggression and conflict, posing safety concerns for officers and community members alike. There are also doubts about the effectiveness of using profiling based on broad categories to detect crime. It is still unclear whether profiling actually increases the success rate or the hit rate of law enforcement operations. Finally, and it's very important to keep in mind that from a legal perspective, law enforcement officials will be held accountable for keeping profiling within the law. Therefore, we updated in 2018 a guide for law enforcement officers that is called Preventing Unlawful Profiling Today and in the Future, and which gives concrete examples and concrete principles for law enforcement officers to identify how profiling can be conducted in a lawful manner. This is a very practical guide. It's not a report in the sense that it doesn't identify trends, but it can be very useful as it does contain a collection of good practices that we have identified in the EU member states. Specifically in this guide, we developed a toolbox around 3 key principles. The first one is to respect individuals' dignity. The second one is to ensure that profiling is based on reasonable and objective grounds. And the third one is that law enforcement officer must guarantee accountability. And I will look into these one by one in the next slide. So the first key principle is to respect individuals' dignity. Any encounter with individuals should be respectful, professional, and informative. Ensuring a good quality encounter does not in itself eliminate discriminatory profiling. However, it is likely to make any encounter more successful and reduce the potential negative impact of stop and search actions. Explaining the reason for stopping a person helps boost confidence in the police and reduces the perception of discriminatory profiling. The second key principle is to ensure that profiling is only performed based on reasonable and objective grounds. Ensuring objectivity in profiling requires, first, to avoid bias, and two, to make effective use of intelligence and information. What you can see in this slide is what we call the cycle of the self-fulfilling prophecy. What does that mean? Well, basically, if a law enforcement officer, if a policeman or woman has a prejudice against a certain group of people, then he or she will have a tendency to stop and search more people belonging to this specific group. Of course, then the proof or the evidence with regard to criminal activities will be found also in a disproportionate manner in this group. And this will reinforce the prejudice that the law enforcement officer had that he or she were right in the first place to stop and search this specific person. And so it does reinforce the prejudice in law enforcement officers by data that they would perceive as being objective, but that are actually not. So it's very important to develop guidance and training to law enforcement officers to explain how this self-fulfilling prophecy is working and how to break it. The second graph that you can see on the slide explain why lawful profiling can only rely on a combination of elements. In the context of profiling, individuals should only be stopped and searched on the basis of reasonable and objective grounds for suspicion. And these are key elements in order to make sure that profiling will remain within the law. It means that police officers must base the decision for singling out an individual on a combination of elements. And this can include objective information such as, specific intelligence, behavior, clothing, or the object that the individual carry with them, as well as subjective knowledge based on experience. So as you can see on the slide, the third one include characteristics based on protected grounds. But these elements alone would make profiling discriminatory. If this element is used in combination with other intelligence, such as a report that the individual that is being suspected of criminal activity does belong to a certain category, then this is not discriminatory profiling. So that's why this is a key aspect of how stop and search must be conducted in order to making it a lawful profiling. And finally, the third key principle is accountability. As any other public agency, law enforcement authorities are accountable to the public for the decisions and actions. This means that law enforcement officers must ensure that profiling is kept within the law. Notably, collecting reliable, accurate, and timely data on profiling activities will be crucial in order to ensure accountability. I will not enter into details for the sake of time, but please have a look in our guide and you will see a number of good practices in order to ensure accountability for law enforcement officers. And finally, this is my third and last part of this presentation. I'd like to say a few words about algorithmic profiling. Recent years have seen an increased interest and use of computer-based profiling in order to support officers and in their work. So what is predictive policing? Well, it is a collection and the analysis of data about previous crimes in order to identify and make statistical prediction of individuals or of areas where there is an increased probability of criminal activity to help developing policing intervention and prevention strategies and tactics. What you can see on the slide is a graph that we have developed that help understanding the different phases for developing an algorithm that will support policing with algorithmic profiling. So what you can see is that you have different phases, and what is extremely important from this graph to keep in mind is that potential breaches with fundamental rights, potential discriminatory impact may happen at each phase of the development of an algorithm. During the preparatory phase, where the algorithm will be developed, during the data collection of data, not to make effective use of the profiling, but to train it. Well, here there can be data that are incomplete, that are biased, resulting in discrimination. In the step 2, when the data is mined and analysis, they can also have a discriminatory impact if the data is not updated or is biased. And finally, in the step 3, where the outputs of the algorithms are interpreted. So earlier in this presentation, we mentioned the self-fulfilling prophecies that happens when law enforcement officer will interpret situation based on their own biases and later on confirming this. Well, computers can do the same thing, and this is what we call dynamic algorithms. When algorithms are constantly redefined and they are improved based on feedback loops. These loops are created by the algorithmic system and cannot be properly understood or even expressed in simple language. However, based on low data quality, the algorithm risks to reproduce existing prejudices and will perpetuate social inequality. And this may create serious difficulties in order to ensure accountability and individual access to remedies. So it's very important here to ensure a proper protection of personal data, to respect the principles that are laid down in the Data Protection Law Enforcement Directive. By protecting the identity of the people and by making sure that these data protection principles are respected, then the potential for discrimination will decrease. So for the sake of time, I will not enter too much into detail, but I just would like to provide you very briefly with some slides that will introduce to you the results of a research we conducted on predictive policing and specifically on feedback loops. So as I said, I will not enter too much into details because this So as you can see, the result was that feedback loops almost always occurred in fully automated settings. And the simulation that we conducted showed several sources of biases. First, that there are big differences in reporting rates, meaning historical data are often not representative and already contain biases. Second, that machine learning algorithms can react to random noise information, and they can also over-rely on historical data. And as we described in our report, crime observability can lead to the formation of feedback loops because these will exacerbate the biases, the prejudices that are already contained in the data. So what are the way forwards? First of all, it's extremely important to test for bias, to conduct tests on the algorithm, both before and during the use of the algorithm, because algorithm can be biased or develop bias over time, and this can lead to discrimination. Second, it's important to provide guidance on sensitive data. In order to assess potential discrimination, there is a need to collect and assess data that are based on protected characteristics. So we need guidance in order to make sure that this collection of data is made in a way that protect personal data and fundamental rights in general. Third, there is a need to assess ethnic and gender biases, so not focusing on specific biases, but also on gender ones. Fourth, and this is linked to the third point, all grounds for discrimination should be looked into. So it's also biases that would be based on disability or age. Finally, this is maybe more for IT specialists, but there is a need to strive for more language diversity when these type of algorithms are developed in order to make sure that the data that is used for training is not reduced to one data set. And finally, there is a need to increase access for evidence-based oversight. One tool that can be used is the data protection impact assessment that is mandatory in certain cases in Article 27 of the Law Enforcement Directive and Article 35 of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. But what applies to you in law enforcement authorities is the LED, so the Law Enforcement Directive. So we have developed also in a guide a step-by-step scheme in order to support you in really identifying the questions that need to be asked before using algorithmic profiling. So to sum up, unlawful profiling can be addressed by effectively implementing these three principles: to ensure respect, objectivity, and accountability when physical stop and search are conducted, to always uphold fundamental rights, and finally, to make sure that these principles are acknowledged at every level of law enforcement organizations and specifically within your hierarchy. That these principles are implemented effectively through appropriate resources and mechanisms, and that they are supported, as I was saying, by high-ranking officers within the law enforcement organizations. So I thank you very much for your time, and please do not hesitate to send me an email, to contact me, and I will be happy to provide you with further information on every aspect of this presentation. Thank you very much. Bye.